Nobody knew why it was called Killer Hill. Of course, we all had our guesses. The older kids used to try to scare the young ones with stories about how some kid had died on the slope. Sometimes they were basic deaths, hitting a tree or a rock, as reckless sledders were known to do. Some were more creative, featuring grisly serial killers sporting rusty axes, just waiting in the bushes for some kid to come down the hill alone. Kids can be pretty fucked up, to be honest. When I was young, I spent a lot of time at the sledding hills with my brother and sister. There was one main hill. We simply called it the Big Hill, but some of the more adventurous kids called it Kitty Hill, because it was no match for Killer Hill. Next to the Big Hill was Twister Hill. It followed a winding path that barely existed and ended with a sharp turn against a tree. A lot of kids smashed their faces into that tree, but most of them got away with just a few bruises, maybe a blooded nose. One year, a kid got hit so hard he had to go to the hospital, and that stopped our fun for the rest of that winter. The third and final hill was Killer Hill. It was a steep drop, full of sharp bumps, and if you weren't careful, you could easily go flying off your sled onto the blank ice that hid beneath the snow. At the bottom of the hill was a small creek. Usually it was frozen over in the winter, but in the early months, sometimes the ice was thin enough to crack. If you couldn't stop your sled before you hit the creek, you had three options. One was to jump sled and abandon it to its fate, hoping that you could retrieve it later. Another was to try and jump the creek. Only a few kids were ever successful in that endeavor. The third was to simply hold tight and fall into the creek, hoping that the ice wouldn't crack. As you can imagine, a lot of sleds were sacrificed to Killer Hill. When I was growing up, my siblings and I were banned from both Twister and Killer Hill. We didn't really mind, to be honest. None of us were risk takers or real thrill seekers. We enjoyed our big, gentle slope. You could still get some speed going without having to worry about braining yourself on a tree stump. But of course, things and people tend to change as you get older. When I turned 12, I started to grow interested in Killer Hill. Just once, mind you, I wanted to taste its slope. Just so I could say that I had done it. I got my wish. That winter, we had a terrible snowstorm. My mum had just managed to get us kids into town to stay with my grandma. We lived out on the farm, and heating and power were somewhat iffy during bad blizzards. We spent a lot of time at my grandma's in the winter, which was just how we liked it. Grandma spoilt us plenty. The snowstorm lasted for 3 days, during which nobody left the house and the schools were closed. Well, that's not entirely accurate. You see, nobody was supposed to leave the house, but it was inevitable that some morons would go outside and freeze to death. It happened every winter. Within a few days, missing persons reports would begin to pop up, followed shortly after by bodies. It was unfortunate, but that sort of tells you something about humanity, don't you think? Anyway, on the third night the storm finally subsided, and by the next day the world was livable again. The plows had managed to mostly clear the streets. Most people still weren't driving, but you could at least walk outside without succumbing to giant slopes of snow. The temperature had risen enough to leave the house as well. School was still cancelled, as it was still too dangerous to drive, so us kids had another day all to ourselves, and I knew just how I wanted to spend it. My grandma didn't live far from the Big Hill. Now, both she and my mother tended to be a little overprotective, and most of the time they wouldn't have let us kids go out sledding just after a big storm like that. But we were sick and tired of being cooped up in Grandma's little townhouse, and they were just as sick and tired of having to deal with us. So they let us take our sleds out with a stern admonition that we were to be extremely careful on the hill. That's an order I was bound to break. We were the first kids to get to the hill that day. We'd gotten up early that morning to ensure we'd have a clean hill to sled on. The snow was still a little full and fluffy, but we'd packed it down during the first few rides. But first, there was something I had to do. My younger brother and sister got a bit quiet as I headed over to the mouth of Killer Hill. I could see the sharp twist of the creek at the bottom, and my heart began to race. Sarah, my little sister and the youngest of us three, immediately started to shout. "You're not supposed to go down that hill. Mom said so." "Hush! Don't get your panties in a bunch. Mom doesn't have to know, because none of us are going to tell her. Got it?" Sarah bit her lip, but she kept her mouth shut. Our brother, Thomas, was only 2 years younger than I was, and I could see the interest in his eyes. He wanted to watch me do it, so I knew he wouldn't be telling on me any time soon. I set down my sled at the top of the hill. It was hot pink. I remember that now, for some reason. That part of my memory has always stood out so strongly. Perhaps it's the contrast of the pink against the snow. I decided to ride the hill on my knees, thinking it would give me the best chance of controlling my trajectory. I positioned myself carefully, holding onto the wooden post at the side of the hill so I wouldn't go down prematurely. I looked down at the sharp fall waiting for me, wondering what it would feel like, the world dropping away from my body. I took a deep breath, and I pushed. It was the ride of my life. The initial push felt sort of like the first drop of a roller coaster. Your stomach flies into your throat, you feel weightless and out of control. I think I screamed, but I don't remember. I was gripping the side of the sled so hard that I thought I was going to break my fingers. I had only a portion of a second to breathe before I hit the first bump. It sent me flying in the air and I almost lost my sled, but I managed to hold on. I landed just fine, only to be thrown into the air again on the next bump. By the time I'd passed all the bumps, my knees were a bruised mess. I knew I'd be feeling it for days. I was speeding the rest of the way down the hill, and I began to feel a strange, bubbling euphoria. This was it. I was going to make it. And then I remembered. The creek, frozen, hopefully, just at the foot of the hill. As I neared the end of the slope, I realized I had a second, maybe 2 at most, to either jump my sled or try to jump the creek. It was no surprise what I chose. I uncurled my fingers from the edges of the sled and rolled off, watching it fly into the surrounding trees, suddenly weightless. What I hadn't anticipated was the fact that I'd built up some serious momentum. I was still sliding forward, ever closer to the edge of the creek. I pressed myself to the ground as hard as I could, scrabbling for something to hold on to. I managed to generate enough friction and finally started to slow down. It was a heart-stopping moment when I just barely managed to grind myself to a halt, my hands hanging off the edge of the creek even as I trembled. I breathed a heavy sigh of relief and was just barely aware of the sound of my sister shouting and my brother cheering me on. Safe, I thought, laughing as I stared down into the creek that I had just narrowly avoided becoming intimately acquainted with. My laughter stopped abruptly when I saw the pool of red, a lone black mitten floating in the congealing mess. My eyes drifted, horrified, to the other black mitten, still attached to a hand. And that hand was attached to a body, a very small, very delicate body with a lot of blood pouring out of its head. Even through the heavy snowsuit the child wore, I could tell that it wasn't breathing. I started to scream. I didn't get into trouble for going down Killer Hill, if you're wondering. I became somewhat famous overnight, though, being the one to find Dylan Fick's body in the creek. His parents had filed a missing persons report on the 3rd day of the snowstorm. They weren't sure where he'd gone, only that he'd taken his snowsuit with him. They didn't think to check the shed to see if he'd taken his sled. Dylan was a 3rd grader, just like Sarah. He should have known better than to go out in a storm, but he was tired of being cooped up all day, like us. He figured he knew the hills well enough, even in the blinding snow. He hadn't seen the start of the creek when he went down the hill. He went headfirst into the ice, managing to hit his head hard against a stone protruding from the creek bed. They aren't sure how long it took him to bleed out, but wasn't a quick death. Not by a long shot. In the end, he was just a kid. All kids do stupid things. Most of them just don't die from them, I guess. The sledding hill was abandoned for a few years after that. None of us would dare go back. None of us could get Dylan's face out of our heads. And I certainly couldn't forget what he looked like, lying on the ice, covered in frost. So still. But I grew up. I'm not a kid anymore. I'm an adult with a husband and kids and a mortgage that I'm going to spend half of my goddamn life paying off. My kids came home from school today talking about a sledding hill on the edge of town. They wanted to know why it's called Killer Hill. They asked me to take them as soon as the first snow hits. You know, when we were kids, none of us knew how it got the name Killer Hill. But I know now how it kept it.